Let's get more in depth with natural selection by going into the modes and types of selection. In this lecture, please be able to define fitness, natural selection, sexual selection, artificial selection, directional stabilizing, and diversifying. List the 3 types of selection, be able to give examples. List the 4 modes of selection, again, examples. If you are given an example, be able to recognize both type and mode and relate selection to the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which is a little more in lab. So evolution, to remind you, is the change in allele frequencies in a population over generations, resulting in an individual that is either less or more adapted to the environment. We talked about gene flow and genetic drift resulting in less adapted individuals. Now we're going to look at natural and sexual selection and even artificial selection, resulting in individuals more adapted to, well, something. And remember, individuals don't evolve. Populations do. Take that, Magikarp. So what are the requirements for evolution through selection? First off, there has to be variability. So there must be different phenotypes in a population, or natural selection has nothing to act on. There must be heritability. Phenotypes must be genetically passed on to offspring, or evolution. Selection is just selecting things, but the offspring will not be different, and there will be no change in allele frequencies in a population over generations. And next, there must be differential survival and reproduction, such that there's one phenotype reproducing more than other phenotypes. This results in a change in frequency of phenotypes in a population, and thus a change in the frequency of alleles in that population over generations. So there is selection, which means individuals with a particular phenotype have a greater reproductive success than individuals with other phenotypes in that population. And over time, that phenotype will become more common. Why is it more common? Well, that has to do with fitness. Fitness is a relative genetic contribution to future generations. So you see here 3 examples of geese. In one example of the geese, they have but a single gosling, and they have low fitness because they are not adapted well to the environment. On the other side, you see a whole bunch of goslings because they have very high fitness. They are very adapted to the environment, and thus the alleles those 2 parents have are going to be passed on at a higher frequency. So here we have another example of fitness where the more dots on a butterfly, the more it will leave offspring. And over time, you can see the allele that leads to more dots is going to become more frequent in the population because it is left to offspring at a higher frequency. So again, remember variability, heritability, differential survival and reproduction. Let's look at types of selection. There are 3 types of selection: natural, sexual, and artificial. These are dealing with the causes of why they are having differential reproduction. In natural selection, it's the environment that makes the selection. In sexual selection, it's mates that make the selection. And in artificial selection, it's humans that are making the selection. So natural selection first. It's a form where individuals are more adapted to their environment, resulting in things called adaptations. The adaptations are the phenotypes that increase survival and thus will increase the fitness of the individual that has that adaptation. You can see here a bunch of beetles. Some are green, some are brown, and this is genetic, where brown is going to be a dominant allele and green is going to be the recessive allele. This is heritable. Green individuals produce green, brown produce brown, and again, you see that the heterozygote is brown. So what happens here is there's natural selection. Birds can find the green ones on a tree trunk more easily than the brown ones. So that's differential survival and reproduction caused by the environment. And over time, the surviving brown beetles will leave more brown beetle babies, leading to the population going from 75% green to 75% brown in a relatively short amount of time. That is natural selection. And that's going to act on individuals, but we observe the effects on the populations. This results in adaptations. The individuals become better matched with their environment. Of course, if their environment changes, then you have to have evolution, once again, trying to adapt to the new environment. This is a non-random process, unlike genetic drift, which is distinctly random. Next up, sexual selection. This is a form of selection where the mates are making the choices, and the birds that look the best are going to be producing the most offspring. Now here's the thing, sexual selection can lead to sexual dimorphism, where the males look very different than the females, or the females look very different than the males. And that's because the selection is acting on whatever phenotype is going to be prettiest. There's also intrasexual selection, where the males may compete for mates. This is when members of one sex directly compete with access to the other sex. So elephant seals battling it out on the beach to be the beach master, fiddler crabs fighting with their large arms, or bighorn sheep just headbutting until one of them gets a concussion. There's variability in this of how well they can fight. This is allegedly heritable and thus will lead to differential reproduction where the best fighters win. There's also intersexual selection, where showy characteristics are going to be selected for. So we see that in these great frigate birds, where the ones with the biggest weird-looking necks are going to be the most attractive. Mormon crickets, which the biggest females are going to be the ones that mate the most. And blue-footed boobies, where they have to dance and show off their nice blue feet. And that's going to attract mates. Again, this can lead to sexual dimorphism, where there's either sizes, if the male becomes bigger or significantly smaller than the female. The color, male can be generally brighter, or the shape, male might have a special feature. And these are the features that are under sexual selection. Last, there's artificial selection. This is where humans just see a wild mustard and think, hey, we could make that taste terrible. We could make it taste terrible in 5 different ways. So that's going to have variability in the offspring of that wild mustard, which is heritable, and leads to differential reproduction when people decide that they want kohlrabi, or if they want a dachshund. A great example of artificial selection is all the different dog breeds where people thought, I want a doggy, but I wanted a lowrider. No, lower. No, lower. And just kept on breeding the lowest dogs until they end up with a, well, get along, little doggy. So all types of selection, remember, require variability, heritability, and differential survival. They result in individuals with phenotypes that are greater at whatever is selecting for them. So something is going to be favorable, and that favorability really depends on what the selective pressure is. So let's look at the modes of selection up next, and that's the result. So the type of selection is a cause, the mode of selection is the result. So we see how the population changes. First off, we have directional selection. This is where individuals at one extreme of a trait are going to have greater reproductive success and thus become more frequent in a population. If you have a bunch of mice here with different colors, and they're against a black background, as we saw a few lectures ago, then you can see these mice against a black background are going to have a greater success if they are, well, darker. This is directional. The direction is for darker mice. There's also stabilizing selection. Let's say that the darkest mice are being hunted and the lightest mice are being hunted because the background is actually kind of a medium brown. And that's where the intermediate trait is going to have a greater reproductive success. And this is, of course, going to decrease diversity by getting rid of the 2 tails, the darkest and the lightest. Then there's disruptive selection, where maybe these are mice on a chessboard, where the white mice and the black mice, so long as they're against white and black backgrounds, are going to have higher levels of fitness. And this is disruptive because what you see is 2 populations are going to be very different than one another. Last, there's balancing selection. Now, this is when natural selection maintains genetic diversity. This could be that the most common color of butterfly wings is going to be recognized by the predator, who will then seek out that pattern of butterfly wings, and those butterflies are going to leave the least offspring in the next generation, thus making that pattern less common in the next generation. And if it's less common in the next generation, well, then the birds are going to not find it as easily, so they're going to look for a different pattern of butterfly wings. So that is balancing selection. We also see that with heterozygote advantage. If heterozygotes have a higher level of fitness than the homozygotes, then they are going to leave behind heterozygote, homozygote, and, well, homozygous, dominant, and recessive offspring. So the heterozygotes are going to be maintained if they have a higher fitness. We see an example of this with sickle cell anemia. Individuals who are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia are going to have more offspring because they don't have the deadly sickle cell trait, and they're less likely to be affected by malaria. These sickle cell individuals, well, these heterozygous sickle cell individuals, are going to leave offspring that are homozygous in both directions and heterozygotes. We also see this in negative frequency dependent selection, where the fitness of a genotype decreases if its frequency becomes higher. You may have been vaccinated against the flu. If you were vaccinated against the flu, you were vaccinated against the most common strains of the flu, meaning those will become less common in the future, thus maintaining the overall diversity of the flu virus. Remember that all types of selection require variability, heritability, and differential survival, result in phenotypes with greater fitness being selected for, and result in favorable phenotypes increasing in frequency in the population. Also remember that all the types of selection and all the modes of selection, all types, can have all modes.